Hello and welcome back as we continue our discussion of American federalism from Chapter 3. In the first video, we were discussing the relationship between the federal government and the many state governments. However, this portion will be dealing a lot with the interactions between state governments themselves. The first provision raised by the Constitution is known as the Privileges and Immunities Clause. This is found in Article 4, Section 2 of the Constitution, and it is clear that according to this, states like California or New York or Texas and more cannot discriminate against citizens from other states. Imagine if you were to leave the state of California to seek employment or residency in another state, and that state had a law that prevented you from being hired simply because you were not a birth resident of that state. You weren't someone who was born in that state. This could pose a challenge. And so rather than leave it up to the states, the Constitution is clear that if you are a United States resident who comes from one state and goes to another, you are entitled to the same privileges and immunities as residents of that original state. The second provision related to state relations is known as the Full Faith and Credit Clause. This is found in Article 4, Section 1 of the Constitution, and it is clear that according to this principle, states must honor public acts and judicial decisions that take place in other states. Imagine if you had filed a restraining order in California, for example, and then you move to a nearby state, let's say Nevada, and let's say your supposed stalker or someone who is trying to get you violates that restraining order. Well, you could call that Nevada police, for example, and they would have no choice but to arrest you because they must honor the judgment that was made in California. Why? Because of the Full Faith and Credit Clause. Imagine this also applying to marriage, divorce, and child custody laws. Yes, the decisions, the public acts that are made in a marriage or the judgments made in a divorce and child custody hearings, these are true across all 50 states. Now, over the years, our interpretation of the Federalist system will endure some changes over time. In the 1930s, the era of cooperative federalism begins thanks to many of the policies set out by the New Deal program. So what was the New Deal? To get a sense of the context, the New Deal was a collection of programs designed to handle the pressures of the Great Depression. In the Great Depression, state governments struggled to handle the needs of its poor. People were out of work. In 1932, for example, 25% of the workforce was unemployed. These are staggering numbers, and until this year, we had not seen them again. The coronavirus pandemic has made conditions similar to this, and we'll see how we'll fare over the next few years. But in response to the Great Depression, President Franklin D. Roosevelt will institute a collection of policies known as the New Deal. And collectively, these policies increase the influence of the federal government. The federal government will grow in size, in budget, and responsibility over the next few decades. This is what is seen as the driving force behind cooperative federalism. So when we think of the New Deal, we can imagine Roosevelt, his first 100 days in office, were so crucial to getting many of his achievements across. He instituted public work programs such as the Tennessee Valley Authority, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and more in order to provide government-funded jobs for any eligible worker who was qualified to perform that task. He also instituted a national banking holiday, froze government budgets, and more. This is rapid action, and so Roosevelt is going to change not only the way we see the presidency, but also the federal government itself. So one of the ideas that Roosevelt pitches is related to the power of the federal government to give grants. This is money that does not need to be repaid back by the states. You give the money that the federal government collects in taxes to the states that need it most. So grants and aid are simply those funds from the federal government given to state governments. The New Deal expanded grants and aid to include things like public employment projects, like highway construction, like things like school lunches. And this becomes a very popular method in which members of Congress and the president combined can reach out to several states and address their concerns. And so we see the expansion of federal grants and aid grow over time. If you look at this chart, you see that from the 1950s all the way to the late 2010s, the simple sheer rise of government spending in the form of grants and aid. Now, to understand the changing nature of federalism in the United States, a political scientist in the 1950s named Morton Grodson provided the cake analogy. Now, this cake analogy is very useful for describing the eras and the changing ideas of what is an appropriate response from the federal government. In the past, from the time of the country's founding all the way to the Great Depression, America operated under a form of layer cake federalism. This is the era of dual federalism in which programs and authority are clearly divided among the national, state, and local governments. National government handles XYZ, state governments handle ABC, and rarely do the two layers of government ever intertwine. Fast forward to that era of the New Deal, we see with marble cake federalism, programs and authority are mixed among the national, state, and local governments. These are two different approaches to the same constitutional provision, and so it's important to recognize the differences. We had a period where federal and state governments were layered, largely separate, and today, thanks to marble cake federalism, we can see just how impactful the federal government and state governments mix their responsibilities together, primarily through the source of funding allocation. Now let's move forward to today to discuss current issues in federalism. If you ever wondered what the death penalty procedure and policy is across the United States, we should recognize that different states across the country have added different provisions on the death penalty. In states like Texas and California, we have seen the death penalty become legalized and accepted as a practice of capital punishment. There are states like New Mexico or Hawaii which do not have the death penalty at any point. Now, this chart was taken from 2017, and in Oregon at the time, the governor had imposed a moratorium on executions, meaning the government will simply postpone any offender who is on death row from having their execution performed, because they, as a politician, as a governor, they have that power and they have chosen not to exercise the death penalty. Recently in California, Gavin Newsom was elected to governor, and he also imposed a similar moratorium. So as long, according to Gavin Newsom, as long as he is governor, there will be no more executions in California under his watch. We see this allows different states to exercise their different preferences with regards to the death penalty. We can also apply it to owning a gun. In several states, there are states which have invoked waiting periods or ban on assault weapons, California most notable. There are also states which require a mental health background check by the FBI's criminal background check system. In 2014, California became one of the states to add the mental health policies to gun laws. And so we see just how different states will react to this problem or this challenge as they see fit of what is an appropriate level of gun regulation. Many states across the country have varying minimum wage laws. We can look across the country. As of right now, in the year 2020, the federal minimum wage is $7.25 an hour. But if you look at states like Oregon or Washington, this number can be increased according to the state. And in California, as recently as 2019, the minimum wage was $11 an hour with scheduled increases over the next few years. So in 2020, this number will rise to $12 an hour, depending on your county or city. And we look across the country and see various minimum wage laws. You might be confused or have a question about these red states, states in which their stated minimum wage is lower than the federal minimum. Nonetheless, even though a state like Montana's minimum wage is $4, they are still legally, constitutionally obligated to provide the federal minimum wage. So even though Montana or Wyoming's minimum wage is lower, they must still be equal to the federal minimum wage. Finally, we're going to turn our attention to federalism and same-sex marriage. The United States has had an interesting turn of events over the past few decades with regard to same-sex marriages, marriages between two people of the same sexual identity. And so the Defense of Marriage Act, otherwise known as DOMA, will pass in 1996. Congress had passed a law which was signed under Democratic President Bill Clinton. And this law said that if states do not want to recognize same-sex marriages, the federal government will also not recognize the same-sex marriages in those states. And so what this is seen as is a victory for proponents of traditional marriages between people of opposite sexes, and example of a loss for supporters of same-sex marriage. So we see differing sides have different opinions on this law. However, the court will reverse part of the law in 2013, saying that the federal government has no business not recognizing these marriages because these marriages were denied due process of law. And if a state has recognized a marriage, the federal government should be obliged to also recognize that marriage. And finally, in 2015, a historic ruling will be made with regards to same-sex marriage. This ruling will come from the Supreme Court, and like many other cases, it has a story. This is the case of Obergefell v. Hodges from 2015. Now, the background of the case, it is a combination of several cases in which same-sex marriages were not recognized by the states or the federal government in various states. In this ruling, the court would rule that the 14th Amendment, the Equal Protections Clause, would guarantee a fundamental right to same-sex marriage. And so overnight, this is going to require all 50 states to offer marriage licenses to two people of the same sex if they request it. What the court is arguing here is that the equal protections, if you are someone who is entitled to the perks of being married to someone, what the court is saying is that the federal government should recognize that as long as people are consenting adults, all that matters is that people are treated equally. So if heterosexual couples can get married, so too should people of same sexual orientations. So that's it for chapter 3. When we come back, we will go on to chapter 4, which is all about civil liberties. I look forward to talking with you then, and if you have any questions, please feel free to message me on Canvas or meet up with me on Zoom. Take care.